Hello, everyone. I'm John Evans. Welcome to another episode of One-on-One. The Food Network and HGTV are both staples in the cable TV world. They're both in the top 20, and they grew under the direction of Judy Girard. Judy was president of each of those networks at one time, adding talents like Rachel Ray, Paula Deen, and others who have now become household names. Judy Girard also launched TV talk shows featuring Jerry Springer, Jenny Jones, and others. In retirement, Judy also helped launch GLOW, the first all-girls charter school in this state designed to help at-risk students. Not bad for someone who took some risks herself as a teenager.
I have a record back in Morristown, New Jersey, for underage drinking and shoplifting.
Ooh.
And I shoplifted one day a whole outfit to go to a football game. I was probably 15 or 16 or something like that. And in Epstein's department store, which was like a Boscov's,
Right, yeah.
Mr. Epstein was, they were all kind of cut out of that same mold. Mm-hmm. And as I was leaving the store, I got arrested. And they took me to Mr. Boscov. And he said, so I can either throw you in jail, and now I realize he probably couldn't, but he scared the life out of me. Or he said, I can have you work. And that's what I'm going to do. You're going to work off every Friday night and Saturday 3 times the value of what you just stole. And I loved working. It was my first job. And I wasn't making any money because I was paying him back, right? Yeah. But it was independent, and you had to kind of be somebody behind the counter, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me. But it did end up on my record, and my grades were horrible. I mean, I was a DNF student. So Ithaca had started a radio, television, film department. And frankly, they needed some women. They only had 2 women. And so that's how I got in. I would have never gotten in. And I only picked it because somebody said to me, well, maybe you can get in here. I mean, I didn't have anything to do with radio film. It didn't really hold any interest to me, but I thought, what the heck, I'll try, because it sounds like something you don't have to learn out of a book, which is why my grades were so bad.
Yeah.
I couldn't learn out of a book, but at the time I didn't know that.
But it's grown to, it's got a huge reputation.
Oh, now it's a huge reputation. Yeah. A huge reputation, yeah, and has put a lot of graduates into this business.
Now you, after my own heart, started in local TV, and I did
Love
too.
Local
TV. And you started at WPVI in Philadelphia, right? How did you get from Ithaca to Philly?
Which is kind of weird. So at the time, the women's movement was gearing up, was maybe halfway through, what ended up being halfway through. And TV stations, of course, were licensed, right? So they went in at that level to do a quota system. And so if you remember, the top 4 categories of jobs in a station had to reflect the population of the community.
Right.
So they needed women really bad in management. I mean, today, you couldn't start in Philadelphia. It's the 4th market in the country.
Yeah.
But they had somebody recruiting at the broadcasting schools to put together internships, all of which have gone away for a lot of reasons too.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah,
yes.
Unfortunately, because they were just so great for the kids and for me, for sure. So that's how I ended up in Philly. I mean, it was really, and as with many jobs after that, during that movement, because you'll find I'm not a big fan of the women's movement, I got offered a lot of jobs that I wasn't qualified for because of that quota system. Or I would get to the job and all the power had been taken away from it. Those 2 things happened all the time, but they could check me off in a box.
So even when you were at Philly, you weren't ready for that, or no?
They put me in charge of Strawbridge and Clothier, which was another kind of Boscov's, and they had this huge contract, because those guys never spent money on TV. They always did newspapers, even to this day. And they had this huge experimental contract with Strawbridge and Clothier, and they put me in charge of producing and the relationship, which was way in over my head. And that wasn't so bad. I mean, I didn't do great at it. But all of a sudden, they made me a director of the 6 and 11 o'clock news. And I had never directed anything in my life.
Right. So you're actually punching buttons and everything.
Yeah. And the crew, but they're all unionized. They're back up and said, who is this incompetent director? We can't let this happen. We can't have this happen. Oh, it was just an awful, awful time. So I was about maybe 3-4 nights in on the 6 and 11. I was supposed to be interning, and the director got sick very last minute, and I had to sit in. And there was a weatherman there whose name was Jim O'Brien.
Jim O'Brien passed away in a skydiving accident, I remember.
Accident.
Yeah,
and Jim was bigger than life, as was Larry Kane, still is. Jim was absolutely bigger than life, but all about Jim. You know, I mean, everything was about Jim, and everything, right? He was a nice guy, but he was very self-centered or whatever. And that news started to go down the tubes, and we took a break because I couldn't keep up with it. I didn't know move cameras. The camera wouldn't move unless I told them. I was doing my own switching. And I didn't know this till many months later. Jim went around to each person in that studio, the 3 cameramen and the anchors, and said, "We are not going to let her fail. You will give her the shots. Don't make her call these shots."
Wow.
And he said to Larry Kane, "I don't care if the countdown's off." Remember, you had to count down tapes.
Right, yeah.
"I don't care if that countdown's off. You go whatever count. Just adjust yourself to that countdown. Don't, you know." And that's what got me through for 2 or 3 weeks at least till I could get a handle. When the skydiving accident happened, Jim's parachute, which wasn't that long after that, it was maybe 6 months after that, his parachute got tied up with somebody else. And that guy had 2 young kids. Oh. And he said to that person, your kids are small, my kids are grown, I'm going to cut loose. And he cut loose.
I never heard that.
Yeah. He cut loose. And, you know, it still gives me chills to this day that you never know, regardless how blusterous somebody is, you just never know who they are or what they're going to do in circumstances like that.
Yeah, being from the Northeast, I mean, I grew up. It was one of the. We got Philadelphia cable, got New York cable, and got Scranton Wilkes-Barre cable. That's where I started in the Scranton Wilkes-Barre market, and he was huge. You're right, Larry Kane, Jim O'Brien, huge. Now,
Action News.
When you were in Ithaca, you also were the roommate of Jessica Savage.
Yes.
Did you keep in touch with her after school to the point where you knew her all the way through her career and her tragic end?
Yes. Yeah, I was there all the way through the tragic end, which obviously was the whole thing from beginning to end was pretty sad. Yeah. She never, because of the tragic end and the overpowering story of that, I really don't think she ever got the credit she should for being the first female anchor ever in the country. They put her on in Texas, and then she was the first female anchor ever at network. She preceded Barbara Walters and all those guys, but she never really got the credit for it because of her own personal weaknesses that you know kind of took her over at the end there. It was like she didn't deserve the history credit, so I've always been kind of resentful of that. When I went to Lifetime, her 2 sisters approached me about doing her life story, and.
Was that difficult for you?
No, because I stayed out of it completely.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I just farmed it out to Hollywood to a really good writer. They did Almost Golden, Seal Award, played her beautifully. And then her mother called me and said, you know, I have the breakdown on tape. NBC had destroyed the tape where she had a breakdown on air. And she said, I have it on tape. And I actually would like to see it played because I would like people to know what drugs, the price of drugs and blah, 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 blah. So we ended up doing a real-life portrait of her after that movie, which launched Intimate Portraits on that network, which became a huge show. But that movie and that portrait, to this day, is the highest rated, as far as I know, is the highest rated shows on Lifetime.
Now, and I asked you if that was difficult for you because, you know, obviously the talent she had and the groundbreaking, you know, career she had before the very end, you knew her as she was rising, and a lot of people only knew her as she was falling.
Yes.
So that I'm wondering how difficult it may, and that's why I asked the question, how difficult.
Well, it was kind of difficult to watch the rise, too, because she was anorexic, and she turned into bulimic in college. She was a top performer when that light went on, or she was on set. I mean, in an interview, there was nobody like her. But she wasn't really wired for that kind of pressure. I would have never thought it would have ended the way it did. I would have never thought she'd go on air. The end, of course, was later than that, but to go on air drugged and have a meltdown, I just would have never in a million years, whatever.
What did you learn from her? Because you say, again, doing some reading up on you, you say you have learned from everybody you really have worked with. Yeah. What did you take away from her?
I learned how to be a woman from her. How to be a woman in the broadcast business from her. I really learned that over and over from her because, first of all, she never questioned her right to sit in that anchor chair, even though everybody said you can only be a weather person. She never, ever questioned that she could get good enough and that the audience would accept news from a female. Period. That was the end of it.
Yeah.
And you know, there was so much pushing back at that time. And so you can't do this, you can't do that. She gave me courage I would not have had.
Did you ever have discussions with others like Barbara Walters about her or any kind of talk? Did you? I mean, I know you've spoken about her umpteen thousand times, but have you ever had other female anchors, young anchors?
I won't source it, but I did have, and you know, a lot of female anchors for years lisp. She had a little lisp, and they patterned their speech after her, and so there were female anchors all over the country that would have this little lisp going on, and I think, oh my God, that's Jessica's lisp. There can't be that many people that have that. And that because they would study her and you know, inflection and how to drop the female voice and all those things she did. Yeah. You know, she had a really big support system of, you know, a psychologist and a coach and all of that. And so there were a lot, and some very good friends and her sisters. And so there were a lot of people around her. But none of us could really get to her. Mm-hmm. Oh, the conversation. Yes, I did have it. I won't say any names because the person worked at NBC, and there was a lot of animosity toward her at NBC. First of all, she came in and got a top job right away, without paying any dues whatsoever from local television. You know how the networks looked at local television. That piece of crap out there. You know?
And you, if you did go from local to network, you either had to work on weekends or overnight or doing something like that and literally pay your dues before you were, quote unquote, good enough or ready to do the prime time. Yeah.
So they not only threw her in the anchor chair, they threw her into the plum job of covering Washington, which she wasn't the least bit prepared to do. Mm-hmm. And that's when the downslide started. And then she met this guy and she married him, and she came home and found him hanging.
He had taken his own life.
He had taken his life. And the court, the wife sued for alimony and got it from Jessica, which was an unusual. I mean, every piece of her story is really kind of sad.
What did you learn from Dick Clark?
How to be a business person. Dick was one of the best business people I've ever seen. To this
you were a production assistant.
I was a production assistant on Bandstand and his specials.
That just
now, not the daily Bandstand, but he would come back and do the weekly and the specials. But he started Dick Clark Productions and saw, I mean, I think he was the first one in the business that said, well, wait a minute, if I'm going to host this show and it's my show, why don't I produce it and why don't they pay me to produce it, not just host it? Yeah. And he took the rights to that show very early.
One of the first content generators.
Yeah. And people loved doing business with him. He had a name, but he was just an honorable guy.
As nice off TV as he was on?
So, yeah. Great picture of product, great conception. People loved working for him, so he had a really good crew. I mean, he really taught me you could be in this business and not be mean.
Rod Serling? You had him. Now, see, as a fan of Twilight Zone, and with family members who are just cult fans of that, I can imagine what he is like. But I want you to paint a picture for me.
Well, do you remember why it blew up, Twilight Zone? Because today it's so applicable. CBS told him he had to include products in the show.
Oh,
that was product placement 100 years ago, right? Yeah. And he wouldn't do it, and he quit. He came to Ithaca College for a couple of years as a visiting professor, I think largely because Cornell was there. He was very, very, very much against the Vietnam War, and he spoke out and organized a lot of rallies and demonstrations and so forth, and his name was such that people would follow him. And he came under a lot of criticism at that time for using his name for political purposes, because people in TV really weren't doing that at the time at all.
But was he a good teacher?
Yeah, he was a really good teacher because his standards were so high. He was a great writer.
Yes.
He was a great writer, and he was a great producer, every little detail. And his standards were really, really high, because it's so easy to cut corners to get it done, right? To produce whatever it is.
But he was ahead of his time.
Oh, so ahead of his time. So ahead of his time. I mean, I think that may be the first television show, maybe that was, it certainly broke. See, I'm a great admirer of anybody that thinks out of the box to this day. and can create a different form of television or a different way to view television in today's day.
Sure.
I am so a fan of people that...
Could you imagine?
There's a handful of them.
What he would be doing now?
I can't
with
imagine.
the CGI and some of those things now.
Yeah, I would think he would have built Netflix 16 times over by now, probably, because he hated the networks. They put too much restrictions on him. As you're looking around, look at the actors and the producers that are producing for Netflix and Amazon and so forth. Mm-hmm. First of all, they're paying big money, and they have the freedom that the networks still won't give them or can't give them. I don't know.
Now, you've seen that come full circle.
Yeah.
So I mean, are you at home now rooting for the performers now?
Yeah. I mean, I forget the figure Kevin Spacey made on
House of Cards, that's so deserved in my mind.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
And I think it's like $20 million or something. It's a huge amount of money, and it is very deserved. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, the performers now coming out, and they have. The power versus the networks, and even local TV stations for a long time. The networks would pay to carry the programming, and then all of a sudden that turned around, and then local stations had to start paying the networks to carry, and I think that's where the split kind of started.
Would you have believed people binge watch though? I would not have guessed.
No.
People would.
No.
I mean, binge watch,
right.
18 episodes, 16 episodes at a time.
It took my wife and I 2 weeks to do it, not one day. Now, I can all the places that you went, Binghamton, Huntington, Pittsburgh, Miami, pick things up along the way. I know you had different job titles, but what kind of things were you doing in some of those places that just led you ultimately to go to New York City?
It was always programming. I loved producing programming, hands-on to begin with, and then the conception of it is the management of it. So, and I wanted to get better and better and do bigger and bigger things. So Philadelphia was great, but it was the fourth market. You couldn't, and Binghamton, New York, of course, is 138 or something. And everybody said, "You are doing what?"
Yeah.
But I knew that it was the guys that owned the Philadelphia station before Cap Cities bought it. And I knew they were really, they were out there. They'd let you do things. So we started a kids news that was really successful there. We started a whole bunch of things that were just fun because it was just a small town and you could do that. You could have a
Wasn't there also a high school quiz show?
Yes.
That was done on the weekends. I remember that.
Yeah.
One of the anchors would host it on
Bernie Fianti.
Yeah. I remember that growing up.
Yeah. So it was different forms of local television in addition to news, which makes the station, and I think with today, a bigger part of the community with a bigger impact. Mm-hmm. You could do it then. West Virginia was owned by the same guys, and they transferred me down there. And the first couple of days I was there, the Marshall plane crash happened. Oh. Remember when the kids?
Yeah, sure.
And everybody was killed. The whole team was killed in that, on the side of the mountain. And I was in charge of news then. And I hadn't been in charge of news before that. I was always just a director, if anything. And I have to say that was the beginning of a deadening out process for me.
Really?
Because I don't know how you cover news, particularly, outside the station when you actually get there, and feel anything.
Yeah.
To this day, I don't know how people do that. I mean, you all have to shut down.
Yeah, there is a difficult thing. Yeah, you have to you don't process it while you're there. You process it afterwards. You really have to process it afterwards.
Hard stuff.
Yeah, it is. It is
really hard stuff.
When you went to New York, one of the things of the many things is that you really took the talk show, Donahue #1, but Povich, Springer.
Yeah.
How did that?
Jenny Jones.
And
Rush Limbaugh, believe it or not.
Yeah. And I guess a lot of people would say thanks. And then a lot of people would say, gee, thanks.
Wow, you did what?
But, that was, did you notice America just wanting to ask questions? I mean, what did you think?
I hate to tell you the story. I hate
well, you got to tell me the story.
Okay, so Donahue was up and
Chicago.
Established and doing great, right? But the NBC stations didn't have them, the O&Os. And that's what I was in charge of. Mm-hmm. So we worked really, really hard for a couple of years to get him to switch, multimedia, to switch him to New York, bring him to New York, tape out of NBC, and put him on all the NBC O&Os. So he was already up and running and established. the Chicago station, we thought he might be going into Chicago, that he wasn't going to leave Chicago. And the news guys wanted a bigger studio anyway. So they did a major build. They were in the middle of a major build in Chicago. New newsroom, beautiful facility, when GE bought NBC. And GE, of course, was all bean counters. It was,
Sure.
I mean, talk about a mismatch of cultures
Yeah.
over the years. Oh, Maron.
Yeah.
And so GE put their foot down and said, unless you can show revenue in those studios, in this studio you're building, it ain't going to get finished. It's done. We're pulling the funding. And about that time, somebody from Donahue's syndicator walked in and said, there's this guy, Jerry Springer. And he was the youngest mayor ever. He's like 26 or something like that in Cincinnati, great mayor. Was running for governor, I guess, and was supposed to win, and then had a female problem of some sort.
Yeah, a little misstep.
A little misstep there. And they said, but he's done a lot of broadcasts. He was an anchor at one point, too, and we think he could do another serious talk show, a serious talk show. And we auditioned him, and he was great. And we needed a show quickly in the Chicago studios. And NBC, the O&Os, once you put them on the O&Os, you're launching the show. So we started. It was a very serious political talk show. And then something happened on set one day. I don't even remember who or what it was, but somebody threw a punch. And he just went into animated action. And the whole show changed on a dime, right then and there. So now it's 20 years later, and we obviously became very successful. Made a lot of money. I remember Jack Welch walking in that studio one day. He was taking his first tour after about 7 months maybe of owning NBC. And he walked into the studio, and Jerry's in the front, screaming and hollering with people taking clothes off and whatever. And this guy comes over to me, and he said, Mr. Welch would like to see you. I said, okay. Mr. Welch said, we're GE, and we have a image to uphold and blah, 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 blah. And he said, this is not the kind of show that I would foresee us doing in the future. And I said, well, in the first 2 quarters, it netted $23 million. He said, okay, I'll see you. We never heard from him again.
I'll see you on my next visit.
Yeah. But now fast forward 20 years. Jerry was on Fox News 6 or 7 months ago. And it's so sad. I actually sat at home and started to cry. Because Jerry wanted to be a politician more than he wanted to be anything in life. And he was a good politician. He was really good. And the sellout that occurs, and that's a harsh word, but the money and the fame, and, it all gets to you, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's hard to walk away from that. And he was having a good time. But what he became, image-wise and content-wise, was not at all what he wanted to do with life.
And so a sad ending to what was a very, very good run all along the way. Now, the same with Povich. Are you kind of disappointed the way some of that's gone?
Same thing.
Yeah, I mean, now he's doing DNA tests on kids.
I know. It all went the same way. The daytime audience, of course, has gotten much, much smaller over the years. It's not and they're fighting like crazy over audience. It's not as big as it used to be, or as profitable. Definitely not as profitable as it used to be.
I want to ask your opinion on something, because when I speak and to groups and somebody asks me the difference between news and entertainment, I point to a current affair being the time when I believe the news and entertainment, really that line between the two became blurred. Because you had someone sitting there looking like me anchoring a newscast, but the topics were not the political story of the day, the DCs, the tragedy du jour, whatever you want to call it. What are your thoughts on something like that, on when that line became blurred?
I agree. I hadn't thought about targeting it to current affairs. It's an interesting question I haven't thought about. But definitely, you're right. Because then a current affair was successful.
It was.
Wasn't O'Reilly hosting it from the beginning?
O'Reilly did it, and then Maury Povich did it for a while, and so I mean.
And it spawned two or three other shows. Pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think that is when it crossed. I don't know what more to say about that.
Yeah, it just seemed...
I guess what I'd want to say about that is that's not. I don't think that's been nearly as damaging, because I think the viewer could tell the difference. as this current environment we're in of cable news networks that have political points of view. I don't know if the viewer tells the difference on that a lot of the time. I mean, they know Fox is one way and they know MSNBC is the other. But like in the coverage of everything going on now, I don't know if they really, I mean, if you watch MSNBC, you think you're watching news coverage of all of this. Are you? Do you think you are?
I don't know. I think you can tell. I think there are those who are, their objective, first and foremost, is not necessarily to be objective.
Right.
And mine always has been,
right.
If I'm doing an event, a political event, and I walk out and 1/3 of the people think I'm a Democrat, 1/3 think I'm Republican, 1/3 think I'm independent, I've done my job.
You've done your job, yeah.
But I just don't think those at that level now, me personally now, are it's not their first and foremost objective to be objective. That's what I think.
Yeah, I agree. And yet it's packaged much of the time, not always, but a lot of the day is packaged as news on all three of those networks. And so I find that more disconcerting than having crossed the entertainment line, because the talk shows did that too. I mean, the talk shows, particularly Phil, did very serious topics. I mean, he did all the original AIDS coverage. He was the only one who would put it on the air.
Yeah.
And only because the NBC O&Os would clear it, would he produce it, would the other stations carry it. The minute we were going to say no to a show, everybody would pull it. But he had a lot of guts, and that really became much more of a news show as time went on, because that was his passion too. How
did someone who does not cook take Food Network to the heights that you did? And I know, because I've heard you say
I don't cook at all.
You don't cook. That is one of the highest,
that's
biggest ironies
funny.
to me that I've ever heard.
I know, that's so funny. Well, to credit the guy before me at the Food Network, it was Eric Ober. Do you remember Eric? Was the head of CBS News.
Yeah.
So he not only didn't cook either, but he didn't even understand cable in any way, shape, or form. So, he doesn't get credit, but he certainly moved the needle on that place. I think what happened is that, I know what happened, is that there were too many food people at the Food Network. That sounds weird, but they controlled the content, and they took food too seriously. So they didn't have the television kind of legs that Eric or I had, or some of the other people over time there. If you were really a serious foodie, you probably wouldn't put a lot of those people on the air because they weren't serious chefs.
So you looked for personalities rather than
first and foremost. Yeah. And there were some people, there were a couple who I'll let go nameless, who couldn't cook at all, but the camera just took them. So, there was a culinary department of 60 people there.
So they would help doing
Oh, my God, they would do everything. And I remember Emerald saying to me one day, I was showing him a tape of one of these people we had auditioned. I said, she's really good. Look at the camera. Look how it goes. He said, she can't cook. I said, well, that's irrelevant. He said, I can't believe you just said that. I said, well, there's 60 people upstairs who are great chefs. And in fact, those people wrote all of Emerald and everybody else's recipes. Because those guys are chefs. They know how to do a recipe for 200 people.
Yeah.
They actually don't know how to do it for 4 people. So they have people redigesting those recipes anyway. But yeah, that was why. I think the fact that I didn't take it seriously, not take it seriously, but that I wasn't a serious foodie, was the beginning. That's why I get credit. It was Julia Child that did this.
Well, yeah. See, yeah. And your conversation with Julia Child, because Julia Child was the one I remember as a kid. Watching, and you'd sit there, and the Galloping Gourmet, but that's Graham Kerr.
But I couldn't talk to him at that time.
Right, yeah, but Julia Child was the one, and what she told you was something similar to that, right?
She said the problem over there is they're taking food too seriously. Food is the language. Food is the language of entertainment. It's the entertainment language. That's all it is. And I said to her, because your voice, your body, don't you think all of that is what makes you work? She said, no. It is, but you'll find somebody else with other personality traits that will be able to do the same thing and just use food as their language.
So Batali and Flay were both there when you got there, right? Was Emerald there when you got there?
Emerald was there.
Yeah, he was already there.
And Emerald was doing Essence of Emerald, which was a serious cooking show. All 3 of them were doing very serious cooking shows. And again, no ratings on that. But Emerald asked if he could do an experiment with a band and a audience. And I said, okay. And I just come back from talking to her, Julia, and I said, I think you're crazy, but okay, let's try. He said, I'm telling you, we can make this entertainment. I just feel it. Because he was an entertaining guy in his kitchens. To this day, if you go in one of his restaurants, he's like Emerald, as he was on the air back then. Mm-hmm. And it took off right away. Yeah. So we put it on 5 nights a week, and then everybody after that, we looked for personalities, and then we launched every show at 9 o'clock after him. And then we would move it out of that slot. Kind of like the Friends lead into the Cosby Show lead in. And then we'd move it out of the slot, and we'd do another one. And then we ran out of chefs that were personalities. And didn't you have to? You had to start searching for women because you had. I mean, you had Emerald, you had Alton Brown. Right. So you really, you said at the time you had to start searching for female cooks, right? Yeah. Well, and there weren't any, and to this day there are not very many female chefs. I mean, it's a hard life for one thing. It's a really hard life, and but there are 1 million women cookbook authors. Sure. And one walked in the door that Martha Stewart was developing, and they had a falling out, and it was Ina Garten. And we looked at the tapes that Martha had done and said, you know what, she's a serious cook, but she's also entertaining. It's like being a voyeur in her house, you know. And then we went after cookbook, Rachel Ray, Paula, all those guys. We just went one after the other. Didn't it take you? It took them to convince you about Paula Deen a couple of times, didn't they? A couple of times, yeah. And what did you see that didn't rub you the right way the first time? We were trying to do a Jeopardy of food show. We decided, let's try and do a quiz show. And her agent had put her forth as a good person for that. And so we were judging her as the host of a quiz show. And she was just okay. She wasn't very good at all. Mm-hmm. And then one day I got talking to her, and she talked about how her husband, was a bad story there, and she started her catering company out of her house, lunches, and her boys and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, oh, there is a lot of substance to this woman. Yeah. You know, I had just seen her as not a very good host. And Southern cooking, and everybody fought me on it. They said, no, she's both too old, and Southern cooking, people are not going to want to like Southern cooking. And she did. She was great. Yeah, we learned from that we really had more room for personalities, but also for food, that it didn't all have to be 30-minute meals or broad-based food like Emerald or Bobby, that you could really skew the food. You could use the food to brand as well as entertain. Did you ever have any resentment that the people you brought in and what they did for Food Network, obviously the Rachels and the Paulas and everything else, but then they went on to do so many other things? Was there ever any kind of, I wish they would just kind of stay with us and not branch off into the 30-minute meals or $40 a day or get their own syndicated shows or anything? Well, we made a horrible mistake. The biggest mistake we made at the Food Network is we didn't have much revenue. We had 2 years to turn it around. The Board of Scripts had given us a couple of years. That was all. And we didn't have any money. We didn't have any big budgets, so we didn't want to pay them very much. So we let them keep their book and merchandise rights, which at the time were worth almost nothing. I mean, there were book sales, but they were worth, not a lot. And it ended up being almost fatal because it turned into such a huge business in every way, shape, or form. So Ken Lowe, who runs Scripps, said, by contract, they have to do anything in television. We did control all the television they did. Scripps owns a piece of Rachel Ray's syndicated show and has made a fortune on it over the years, those kind of things. Ken said, let's buy a home shopping network, and we'll make them go on the home shopping network with their merchandise and books because they have to do that, and then we can make up some of this revenue. So he bought this little home sports shopping network in Nashville, Tennessee. And I like things that are impossible, and the Food Network had been turned around. So I said, I want to go to Nashville. Let me give that a try. It actually was successful, started to be successful, but it was such a horrible business. Mm-hmm. You have to manipulate people at home to buy obsessively off a credit card that you give them most of the time. It didn't feel right? Man, it felt horrible. First of all, it was such a direct relationship between what we were doing in the studio and the viewer, not like normal television. Mm-hmm. They're out there, but you don't really interface with thousands of them. It was awful. awful. So we kept it going for about a year and a half, and we closed it down, and 700 people lost their job. And that's when I decided I think I should retire. I think it was time to. I was in late 50s and thought it was time. And then Ken asked me, he said, "You really want to go out on a failure?" And I went, "Oh, come on, don't do that to me. Don't do that to me." And they were having trouble at HGTV, so I went and ran HGTV for a couple of years and then retired.
And again, what did you see there that
they had the same problem at HGTV, although it was successful. Their formula down there was Knoxville, was to make it a how-to network. So flipping houses, how to decorate, it was very how-to, and they clearly didn't want any big talent because talent gets so expensive. Really can screw up your P&L. They really can. So, but the numbers on it were dropping. So when I came in, I brought some of the original team from Food Network, and we did the same thing, but in a little more laid-back way, which was to look for personalities, the Property Brothers and Prairie Women and people like that were personalities, but would still keep the integrity of the content, because that content's much broader, obviously, than food is. About 6 months before the election, HGTV started hitting the first place cable network in the country.
Yeah.
And it stayed like that. I think people get weary of the news networks after a while here. And HGTV and Food Network are among the two highest rated networks in the country.
Yeah.
Which is like astounding to me still, because when Ken started Home and Garden, everybody laughed at him and said, "What are you going to watch paint dry?" And he really started it because Lowe's and Home Depot were becoming big enough that he said those two advertisers will pay for a small audience that's specifically interested in all their products, which is what happened.
It's the same thing why they asked, when you put weather on cable, what are people going to watch weather for?
Right.
I mean, good gracious, what that has grown to, the Weather Channel.
Yeah. And I think we all underestimated, even those of us working on it, we underestimated that the viewer wants a neutral, not terribly engaging, concentration-wise. Mm-hmm. They want a couple of networks for that. I mean, they're much bigger than anybody would have thought.
Talk to me about, you were in New York City, and correct me if I'm wrong, you were in New York City on 9/11?
9/11, yeah.
Talk to me about that.
It was, my mother had actually died the week before, and I couldn't get out of the city. They closed everything. I was really that day going to go up and handle some things, and then, of course, it hit. Our offices were on 42nd Street, not far from the Empire State Building. And they quickly, they thought that building was going to get hit next, so they quickly evacuated everybody. So we lost track of where everybody was, and there was no way to get out of the city, there was no way to get home or whatever. The kitchens were over on 9th Avenue. And so most of the staff, including me, made our way to 9th Avenue. And then we just stood there looking at each other going, what do we do? What do we do? We got on a conference call right away with Ken and HGTV and said, are you guys going to stay on the air? I mean, we weren't news-orientated at all. Mm-hmm. And we decided to stay on the air but pull all the commercials and not do news or whatever. And again, the ratings went up very high in the next 24 hours because people kept switching it on and off, those two networks, to get away from how scary this was. Emerald was in taping, and we had a lot of food, and we had a full kitchen staff over there. And he said, I'd like to take food down there. I'd like to, by 5 o'clock, take food down there. And the police wouldn't let us do it because they said, we don't know what's in those buildings. We don't know what those guys are breathing, but you do not. We don't want. You just can't do that. So we shipped food down there. And then he started cooking for the hospitals that were up on the Upper East Side because everything was shut down. You couldn't get anything anywhere.
Now,
it was an incredible city for the next 3-4 weeks. I mean, the way that city pulled together and the change in the way people related on the street even was phenomenal.
You mentioned a second ago, the fact that people were turning off it to get some relief from what had happened. To get a little bit of relief.
I don't think they were actually watching us. I think a lot of people use TV as noise background.
Sure, I think so. But do you think then the search for something other than the daily recovery from that helped?
Yes.
The Food Network, HGTV, and everything else?
Yeah, it definitely helped. Definitely helped. Yeah. It because the numbers the number of people watching both networks went up and never went back down.
Yeah.
Never went back down. And as I say, now it's really soaring.
By
the way, I don't know what the future of those networks are. Ken and I were having this conversation the other day, because Ken's been so supportive of the school here we'll
Sure.
talk about. But I don't know what the future is, because, what's the future of any of these cable networks in terms of the business?
OTT,
when everybody
and you
wants
pump
to,
everything right to OTT, and
Right.
desktop or smart
Right.
TVs.
Right, and you do it in little pieces.
Yeah.
But no one has figured out, no one wants to tolerate an ad at the same time. So
That's
how
the
do
key
you,
to the whole thing.
How do you make any money? Because the distributors are not making up that money. So you're darned if you do, darned if you don't.
How do you take being named a TV's Wonder Woman, or one of the 50
God.
most influential women? But I ask you in the way that when we started this, you talked about the women's movement, and you talked about getting a job that you weren't ready for. So when you talk about when you're named one of the most influential women and a Wonder Woman, the snicker aside, you've got to be, though, proud of what you've done as someone who's walked forward and carved paths for so many others to follow behind you.
I'm proud of the fact that I could mentor a lot of women. It's been a real honor to mentor women. And I guess that, as you get older and you try and figure out what your purpose in life is, I think that always was my purpose in life, and it certainly is now, still in retirement, is to mentor the women that came behind me. And the mentoring is, who are you in the workplace? Right? It's not just mentoring into jobs or matching women to jobs or environments that work for them. It's the discovery of who you are in the workplace. Because women management styles, finding your management style that works best for you and that's effective for you, men and women, but particularly women who get in these, as you get up the corporate ladder, you feel like you have to be more and more like a man, because everything is judged based on more male characteristics than female, from performance reviews to whatever, And I think it's really hard for women to find themselves. I think a classic woman management story happened last week with Uber. I think the way Adriana Huffington handled what took place in that board meeting, is classic, a woman who's very sure of herself and who she is as a manager, which obviously she is, and built a business. Because she just made a little joke of it, and he was gone by the end of that day.
Yeah.
Didn't scream and holler, didn't make she just handled it as you would want a corporate board member to handle it, male or female. And I think, clearly she's found her management legs over the years and all she's done. I think, and without ever selling herself out.
And that's
amazing. The big deal.
It's amazing that you use that two words, sell out, is because that's where I was going next. With all the steps that you've taken, was there a time when you were about to and then had to catch yourself, as far as, making sure that you were still yourself in all those decisions?
I have a terrible sellout story. I was production manager in Philadelphia, and I was up for program director. I was up for a promotion. And the guy who was actually going to make the decision was producing a race up in Watkins Glen. And he called me on Friday night. He said, and I had a film crew under me. And he said, I need your crew up here tomorrow morning. And he said, I need them badly, because blah, blah, whatever had happened. And I called the helicopter guy, and he said, the weather's not great. He said, I'd probably fly in it. He said, but I don't know. You got to decide whether you want to take a chance on this, because they had to go over the mountains of Pennsylvania to get there. And I called this guy, and I said, I don't think we should do this. I know you need him, but blah, blah. And I wasn't forceful about it. I was wishy-washy about it. He said, if you're going to be in management, you can't be a wishy-washy female. You can't, And I thought, oh, my God, he's right. He's right. I said, you're right. I said, we'll send him there. We'll have him there in the morning. Well, they went into the side of the mountain, and they were both killed. And Ben's wife was pregnant at the time. It was the hardest day of my life to go tell her what happened. And I thought, I'm never not trusting my gut again. And if my gut is a female gut, and that female gut may be different than a male gut, so be it. I need to honor it. And I think I found my own management style over the years, which is very different than a guy's.
What do people not know about the networks? I think people have an idea what goes on when you make decisions about programs. I mean, but what don't people know about the networks and decisions and the people who are in those boardrooms? Or is it pretty much understood?
Oh, wow, that's a really, really good question. Really good question. I think people sense power is power, and where decisions come from. I think, I guess the harassment issue is certainly front and center with Fox and all that's gone on there.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah. Roger Ailes, by the way, is one of my favorite people in the world, was. And I don't believe, I won't get started on that unless you want me to.
It certainly is, the fall of a man who had a huge impact in this industry.
Huge impact in this industry, yeah, huge impact. I don't know if I have an answer to your question on that.
Yeah,
I really don't.
I'm just curious.
I can't. I think there's more horse trading, and than people realize for sure. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it's like the old days. I mean, the old days, there was a lot of corrupt power and a lot of... Cokie Roberts I was watching our Morning Joe or something a couple of months ago, and she said, you just... And I remember this so well with her, too, working with her. And she said, you just knew at Rockefeller Center, when the elevator doors opened, certain managers were on, you didn't get on alone. Because whatever happened, it wasn't going to be, it wasn't going to be... Because you weren't equal when that door closed, right? Yeah. And so you just took the next elevator. It wasn't a big deal. I thought, she's right. Yeah. We all did that. I think there was a lot going on behind the scenes that maybe is there today, but probably not. I don't think as much.
What did you learn climbing Mount Kilimanjaro?
That I learned, it's probably the first time I ever surrendered to another human being in my life. There were 4 of us that climbed. 2 of them were in great shape. 2 of us weren't. And the 2 in great shape didn't make it because they got altitude sickness on that last snow covered, right? Mm-hmm. And you leave at 5:30 at night to do that last snow-covered mountain, which is a killer, and you get up there by sunrise. And I had a 16-year-old Sherpa with me, and we started up, and I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. And I said, I'm quitting. We're going back. He says, and he didn't speak much English, and he said, no, I'm going to get you up. And he put his walking stick behind him, and he said, hold on. And I almost didn't do it because I thought, I've got to totally surrender to this guy.
But you would have come so far to not make it.
And he pulled me up that mountain, and I totally surrendered to this kid. I had never surrendered to another human being in my life. I'm a workaholic, crazy, single person. And we got to the top and saw the sunrise, and it was just a remarkable experience. And he was so happy to do it. I've never surrendered. I don't think I've surrendered since then.
Did you have something you wanted? I mean, there's got to be a reason why you wanted to do it, or was it just there?
I wanted to do something. I wasn't working. I had taken a job at Disney, which was a totally mismatched culture for me. And it was a 5-year no-cut contract. And after a year, it was a brilliant idea, Michael Eisner. We reported directly to him, and he was, of course, really tough. But it was a brilliant idea he had, which was to combine Disney with the 4 telephone companies that were left and wire. They had all the wiring in the households. Why should cable have all this strength?
Right.
And so I and a team were hired to program it and conceive it and whatever, and we just could never get agreement with the phone companies on anything. So we failed. But I had this no-cut contract, so I thought, well, I'm 54 or something. I don't need to work again. And I want to do something that I don't think I can do, way outside my comfort zone. And Bob Turner, who headed the syndication company for Donahue and Jerry and all those guys, said, I'm going to climb Mount Kilimanjaro with a couple of people. Why don't you come? And I said, okay. And he didn't make it. To this day, he's really annoyed that he didn't make it. He's really, really annoyed.
Yeah.
And it was by far the most satisfying thing I've ever done. It really was.
Awesome.
I've always wanted to walk the Camino Trail. Now there's somebody locally in town who's putting together a group, and I think I'm going to commit to do it. Try it. I don't know if I can make it. But I feel the same way about it. I'm at a point in life where I need another challenge.
So you retire from television. You start mentoring at the Cameron Business School at UNC Wilmington. And then Glow.
It comes out of nowhere, right?
Yeah, talk to me the nucleus, because, and we'll get into the specifics of it, but what's the nucleus? Where did that come from?
It's kind of odd. I had volunteered at the Harlem Girls' School that Ann and Andrew Tish had started in Harlem 20 years ago. They have 6 schools up there. And I had volunteered one night when I was running the Food Network to coach a kid for her college interview. And there were about 150 kids and volunteers, and all the rest of them succeeded, and this kid and I didn't. We didn't finish. It was a disaster. It was terrible. And it was my fault mostly. So I went back up and started to work with her. And then I saw how that school worked, and how they take kids that are at-risk girls in a public school up there and get them ready for college, and 98% of them graduate, and 100% of the kids that graduate go to college. They get them into college, they get their funding, they do the whole 9 yards. I thought, wow, this is remarkable. I come down here not thinking anything about schools. I don't know anything about school. And long story short, I volunteer at Rachel Freeman for something, and Georgia Miller, who was the wife of the chancellor, volunteered at Snipes. And I went to their house, that mansion, for a cocktail party one night because Ann Richards, chief of staff, had come in to speak it, and I knew her, and I just wanted to see her. And as I'm walking out the door, Georgia said, well, like, who are you, and what do you do, and blah, 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 blah. And I said, and so what interests you? And she said, well, I volunteer at Snipes, and, it's terrible. They don't have enough books. They don't have enough. I said, you should go look at this Harlem school. There's 6 schools up there. They got this thing down. Within 8 days, we had Ben David, we had 2 people from the school board, we had all these people. We had John Monteith, we had all these people going to New York, and they toured the Harlem school, and in LaGuardia on the way home. It was that simple. We all sat around and said, you know what, we should do this. We should do this. You have very segregated schools here. These kids are really in tough circumstance. School can't really address them. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to do girls. Let's get the girls out. You get the girls out, it impacts the community.
So the first year's in the books.
First year's in the book.
And you've got ready to grow.
Yep, we have 122 applicants for the second year. So we have our 100 that we need for the second year. And then we'll continue to 2023 will be the first graduating class. And the first year's kids have been remarkable. They have been just, remarkable. And I think for me personally, one of the best experiences, we had a donor who will stay anonymous, who called. It was a woman engineer, and she said, I bought out the Carmike Theater, and I want you to take all 100 girls to see Hidden Figures. And I've had so many, and to see those girls get that story. Yeah. Oh my God. It was experiences like that they would never have in addition to academic help and so forth. It's been a great year. And the town has really gotten behind us. I wasn't sure the town would get behind us, particularly because charter.
Give you as much pride as anything you've ever done?
More so, because you're changing lives. I think you change lives in broadcasting all the time, right? But you don't know it. You affect lives, certainly. But yeah, it's been the most rewarding thing ever. It's also been the most exhausting because nonprofit, bureaucracy, politics, fundraising, all stuff I'm not comfortable with. But it's a great team there, and I kind of just hang around it and see what I can do.
What brought you to Wilmington?
Well, actually, Bill Sappho. Pittsburgh. There's a whole Pittsburgh Greek community that both works at the station there and lives there. And Sappho's father's from there. Doogie's from there. So I used to come down and visit people that I worked with in Pittsburgh. They would vacation down here. Okay. So I had gotten married at age 57, finally gave up the independence. And he wanted a beach. Richie wanted a beach. And we said, I don't want to go to Florida. So there's this place in North Carolina. Let's go look there. And we bought a condo out on the beach. I really did expect to read books on the beach, and that would be it. I did not expect to. But
I just don't see you as somebody who's going to sit there and read books on the beach. Unless it's something that you know the person who wrote the book.
I don't know. I did. I thought I would do that, but I haven't lived in a small town since I was a kid. Small being that you know people and you have time to know people. I mean, I moved every 4 or 5 years. I never knew anybody. So, my next door neighbor will like bring a dessert over, and I go, wow, this is what people do in towns where you relate to people.
Yeah. Well, I must tell you, as someone who started in local TV and came up as a part-time sports producer and then worked radio in the morning and TV at night till I got my first-time job.
Oh, my gosh.
To have somebody else who started in local TV do as well as you have and impact the industry as much as you have, I have really looked up, since learning your story, I've really looked up to you and respected you in a great way.
Oh, my God. Thank you, John. That's great.
The National Academy of Arts and Sciences honored Judy Girard with a Lifetime Achievement Emmy Award, recognizing her impact on television programming. But she is still making an impact, mentoring women and helping at-risk children achieve success through the Glow School. If you'd like to learn more about it, it's glowacademy.net. If you know someone who you think would be a good interview for an upcoming episode of the podcast, drop me an email, jevans@wect.com, or you can reach out to me on Facebook or Twitter. I'm on those social media sites every day. And if you like this episode, please leave a review or a rating. That'll help us get even more listeners. I'm John Evans. Thanks for joining us for this episode of One on One.